Skittle-do, I said bim bop. Skittle-do, I said bim. Skittle-do, I said skid out and bop. Skittle-do, I said bim bop boom. Skittle-do, I said bim bop. Skittle-do, I said bim. Skittle-do, I said skid out and bop. Skittle-do, I said bim bop boom.
We're continuing to talk about chapters 1 through 3. We've already talked about chapter 1, and we have talked about the vision that John had of the exalted Christ walking among the churches and holding the pastors of those churches in his right hand. Now we're going to see in chapters 2 and 3 that Jesus has a specific message for each of the churches. He knows what their issues are, what they're going through, and he has both words of comfort and consolation and commendation, and then he also has words of complaint, things that he wants corrected. At any rate, as we begin to read each of these letters, one of the most important things to take note of is that each of the letters follows exactly the same form or format. Here is the general form of the 7 letters. First, there is the address. It'll say something like this: "To the angel in the church of Ephesus write." Or to the angel or messenger in the church of Smyrna, write this. Or to the angel or messenger in the church of Pergamum, write this. Or to the angel or messenger in Thyatira, write this. That'll be the very first thing that we come across in each of the letters, the address. The next thing you'll have is you'll have Christ's self-designation. He'll speak about him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand. Or he'll say, "I'm the first and the last." Or he'll say things like, "I was, dead, but now I'm alive." There'll be his own self-description or self-designation. The next thing you'll have is Christ's commendation, the things that he's generally pleased with or wants to commend the churches for. So as an example, he'll say, "I know your hard work. I know your perseverance, and I commend you for that." The next thing we'll find, though, after the commendation section is a condemnation section, or a complaint. Jesus will say, "I hold this against you. I commended you for this, but you've got to know that this is wrong, and I hold this against you." After which you generally find a warning. The warning will be something like, remember the heights from which you've fallen, and repent and do the things you did at first. Finally, there'll be some sort of exhortation, something like, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches," followed by a promise, something like, "He who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death." At any rate, if you read each of the letters, you will find that these 7 parts of the letter are there in the letters. Now that we know that, how do we interpret each letter? Well, I would suggest to you a 4-part method for interpreting the letters. First, you want to compare the letters to each other. As you do that, what you're going to find is that the difference really is in the body of the letter, both the commendation and the condemnation. The address in most cases is the same. It's just one place or the other. The real meat or the real things that you'll see different one to another is what you find in the body of the letter. Now, one of the things you're going to do as you compare the letters is you're going to see that, as an example, there are a couple of churches where there is nothing to condemn. I mean, Smyrna and Philadelphia, there's just nothing to condemn at all. There's just an encouragement or accommodation, comfort. On the other hand, in one of the letters, there's nothing to commend at all. The church in Laodicea, there's nothing good. It just dives right into the complaint. And so if, as an example, in those cities, you see that one part of what's normally there in the standard format's missing, that tells us something very important. Next, number 2, you want to research the historical context. So it's good to know, what were the distinctive historical, events or circumstances in each one of these cities. How did the church get started? What were some of the distinctive challenges that it would have likely faced? Then what you want to do after you understand all that is you want to analyze the distinctive statements in light of that historical context. And then only after having done all that work do you then attempt to discover the message for today. You shouldn't just immediately jump to the message for today without doing some of this other work first. So I'll give a few examples. If you read the letter to the church in Ephesus, one of the things that you'll do is you'll take note of some of the history of Ephesus itself. You'll see that there was an Artemis and Diana cult that was very prominent. In fact, in the city of Ephesus, it was well known for the huge temple to Artemis that was there. You'll also take note of the fact that imperial worship was very strong in the city of Ephesus. Domitian, as the emperor, was being worshipped as God on earth. There's also a huge library that was filled with magical writings, and the city of Ephesus was known across the Roman emperor for its magical scrolls and magical writing. And for that reason, you can see that there was a lot of external doctrinal challenges and a real temptation toward kind of syncretism in this multicultural, multi-religious environment. And now the particular commendation and condemnation or complaint makes a lot of sense. On the one hand, they're commended for their orthodoxy, for rejecting errors and staying true. But then, on the other hand, they're condemned for having lost their first love. And probably, once we know that, more likely than not, their losing of their first love was not necessarily the vertical love that Christians have for God, but maybe the horizontal love that Christians are supposed to have for one another. There was such a suspicion about false doctrine that was typical, that could creep in, that people sort of, instead of embracing and loving one another, were kind of holding each other at an arm's length. And Jesus basically is telling them they have to be aware of what you might call loveless orthodoxy. And now, as you try to relate that to the message of things that are happening in church, you can find plenty of churches that are so concerned with maintaining orthodoxy and truth that they lack love and grace. And so perhaps the message for us today is to avoid loveless orthodoxy. We know we need to hold both grace and truth in tension with one another, and always speak with one another in loving ways as we hold firm to doctrine and to truth. Another example, Smyrna. One of the things you find out is that they had a very large Jewish population, and in light of the fact that Christians were being particularly persecuted across the Roman Empire, this gave the Jewish population the opportunity to distinguish themselves for Christian and slander Christians. One of the things that you'll see is that is what's going on, that they were being slandered, that they were facing persecution, even imprisonment, and potentially even death. You'll find in this letter there's no condemnation. They're not doing anything wrong. They're just a church beleaguered by suffering and persecution, whether that's social or economic or even, physical persecution, imprisonment, or even death. And one of the things we may learn as we begin to think about the message for the church today, after we realize the historical context and what's being written, is that Christians today naturally will also face persecution, and we should bear up underneath it, whether that's social persecution or economic or even in some cases physical persecution, depending on where in the world you live today. One more example, to the church in Laodicea. Laodicea actually was part of the Lycus Valley. There were 3 cities nearby, part of a tri-cities. Hierapolis was very well known. It was right nearby. Also Colossae, to which we have the letter of Colossians in the New Testament. That city was nearby. And then Laodicea. And what's interesting, you should just know this, that Colossae was known for its cold water. There was a mountain nearby, and there was great cold drinking water. Hierapolis was known for its warm springs. In fact, it was a place that many people went to visit. Even Cleopatra herself visited Hierapolis because of the famous warm springs that are there. Laodicea, on the other hand, had no natural water itself. It had to bring in water from an aqueduct, and the aqueduct actually ran from Hierapolis, so that by the time the water got there, it was no longer hot water, it wasn't cold water, it was poor quality, lukewarm water that was not useful either for drinking or for washing and bathing. And so that was something that Laodicea was known for. Laodicea was also known as a very wealthy city. It was a banking center in that part of Asia Minor. There was a very strong textile manufacturing element to the economy that was there. And there was also, it was well known for having a medical school, particularly with regard to ophthalmology and medicine for the eyes. And so if you know that, it's going to give all kind of texture to what you find. You're going to find to the church in Laodicea, there is no commendation at all. There's nothing good that Jesus says, boy, I just want to commend you for this. Instead, they're in a lot of danger. They're a very wealthy city, and there is the danger of physical wealth, but spiritual poverty, and a kind of smug self-sufficiency, that they have it so well that, man, it's easy to become complacent and just, not rely on Christ. And of course, the complaint is, Jesus says, I wish you were either hot or cold, but as it is, you're lukewarm. Which likely means this, that, hot water is useful for something, cold water is useful for something. Man, because you're neither one, you just have stopped being useful. And so there is this idea that as Christians, we should be careful, especially of the dangers of physical wealth, but spiritual poverty, this danger of becoming smug in our own self-sufficiency. And there needs to be a return to Christ and zeal for Him, a dependence upon Him for our spiritual vitality. Anyway, hopefully that gives some sense about how to go about interpreting these letters, and then, having understood the historical context, understand what the meaning is for us today. Finally, before we finish, I just want to speak a little bit about the picture that emerges about what the churches were going through in general. And there's at least 4 things that I like to note. First, it becomes obvious that these churches existed in an environment which was very multicultural, it was religiously diverse, and there was a real challenge of syncretism. Religions commonly borrowed from each other, but Christianity, one of the things that Jesus warns against is just the dangers of just becoming syncretistic with regard to doctrine. Another issue which becomes plain as day is that Christians in these churches were facing very intense persecution, social, economic, and even physical persecution. Another thing that becomes obvious is that there's a danger of cultural compromise. And here, not just on the doctrinal level, but in everyday life. Individual Christians were being tempted by sexual immorality and by the idolatry which existed in the culture all around them. And it also is clear that there is a potential presence and problem of complacency. It's easy for churches to just let down their guard and zeal, to blend in with the culture around, and there's a call to just wake up and get a vital connection with the exalted Jesus, who is walking among the churches and who holds the pastors in their right hand. Hey everybody, thanks for taking time to watch this video. Hope you enjoy it. If so, make sure to like, comment, share this on your social media feeds. We want to encourage you to come out on Sunday morning to Sunlight Community Church. Our service times are 9 and 11. And if you'd like to learn more about the book of Revelation and you enjoyed this video, I encourage you to go to our YouTube channel and you can watch these episodes from the beginning and see the entire series. Thanks so much.